Congrats, man, on the peak. I mean, it feels like yesterday that you guys kind of put the word out there that you were starting it up, and it's just grown, obviously, at super impressive pace. So way to go. And it's a great product.
Thank you. It's funny when you're in it day to day, you don't feel the growth. You more
Yep.
feel the frustration of not growing fast enough, or at least
No
as
doubt.
fast as you want to. And so it's good to put it in perspective. But yeah, I think we've got a long way to go.
Super pumped that you agreed to come on. And one of the things that makes you different as a guest, Brett, is just the fact that you're probably not best known for what you did in politics, but I would think that a lot of your skill set, a lot of the way you approach problems, those types of things was shaped at least to some degree by what you did in politics. I think that might be kind of an interesting way to approach it. Does that kind of make sense?
Totally. And now, I was thinking about it on the way here. I was walking back from my girlfriend's house, but one of the reasons I left politics, I think, was my mental health, which is kind of interesting as well. So happy to get into that. Happy to get into that too.
Perfect.
Well, why don't you just share that story right off the bat then? Go
yeah,
ahead.
If you don't mind.
Because yeah, I mean, one of the in the trailer or in the first episode that Emile is speaking about, that it's available. Well, it'll of course be up by the time that this episode goes up. It took me a while for me to realize that was really the same reason why I left, at least, active politics.
Mm-hmm.
I've done consulting in the years since I left government, but yeah, it was at the time, it was kind of cloaked in this story of I want to start my own consulting business, and I've, had enough of the politics. But really, I mean, yeah, I'd had enough of it because mental health was a big part of it for me.
Yeah, should we just get into it?
Let's go for
cool.
it.
Yeah, so look, I can kind of give a quick background on my time in politics, and then we can talk about the exit afterwards. But, I was involved in politics at a very early age, I think relative to most people, which is probably a good thing. But I got started when I was 16. I was just knocking on doors. John Tory was the candidate for the PC party in Ontario. And there's this guy named Andy Pringle, who was a good friend of his, who was running for the seat in Etobicoke Lakeshore, just south of where I grew up. And, I just thought at the time it would be good to get involved. And this is something that I believed in at a young age. And I thought it would be good, professionally speaking, to just start, going and volunteering and seeing what it was like. And so that's what I did. So I showed up, and they had me stuffing envelopes for mailers. And then eventually I kind of upgraded to knocking on doors. And I can't remember, there's very few times in my life that when I was that excited to do something than when they said, hey, you get to go out with the candidate and knock on doors. For a 16-year-old kid, it was quite something. And I remember exactly when it was, because when I was folding the mailers, we were talking about the iPhone. The iPhone was just announced. So it was a very long time ago. And so I started knocking on doors. And then, I just got more and more involved. I started attending conventions. I got involved in the riding association locally. There were leadership campaigns. Obviously, John Tory had lost. And then there were leadership campaigns after that. And I started volunteering around there. And you kind of get sucked into it. And slowly but surely, you ultimately land. Throughout university, I was involved in whatever way I could be. In the summers, I was doing the internship for the PC party at Queen's Park, and I was working on every campaign that I could. So I worked on all of the central campaigns, doing, as you do in politics, a range of things. So going from, issues management to digital, which is kind of where I eventually specialized. But I did that for 2 of Tim Hudak's campaigns, both losing campaigns. And I think by the time I graduated, I wasn't really sure what to do. A lot of my friends had paths ahead of them. They were going to grad school, they were going to law school, and I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do at that point. And the default for me was politics. And so I left. I started at Queen's Park full-time doing digital in caucus services when the PCs were in opposition. And I did that for about 6 months. And eventually I left. And there's a bunch of reasons why I left. And since then, I've been kind of moderately involved in politics. I'm still obviously very interested in politics. My views around politics have changed dramatically, probably more dramatically than anyone else you'll have on the show. So that's been kind of an interesting process as well. But yeah, in terms of, and I think what you guys are doing is so important on the mental health component, because when I think back to it now, a lot of what drove me to get out, whether I knew it at the time or not, as you mentioned, Dale, was that I just didn't feel myself in the role. And I think that was a big part of it.
But what do you mean by that exactly? Like you didn't, and I guess at that time, what job were you working in, and what exactly do you mean by you weren't feeling like yourself? What do you mean?
Yeah. The job I was working in at the time was I was doing digital and caucus services, and At that moment, I think the number one driver for me was I was bored. We were in opposition. It was the middle of the summer. The legislature was out there. We were in between campaigns. There wasn't a lot to do. There was a majority liberal government. And so I was mainly bored at that point, and I was looking for other opportunities. And I kind of knew that politics wasn't going to be my future. But a deeper problem, I think, was that when I was in politics, I was doing a lot of stuff that I wouldn't feel comfortable doing outside of politics. And there is an environment where you're being encouraged to, and we can get into examples of this. And this is, by the way, of no blame. I don't blame anyone who is involved in this or, guiding me in this direction. But there are a lot of things that I did, and this is especially on kind of the issues management, opposition research side, that I just felt uncomfortable with. But because you're in this environment where it's a team sport, where you're competitive, that you just end up doing a lot of things that I don't think you would do outside of politics. And that made me very uncomfortable. And I didn't want to have a cycle of continuing to do that.
Well, like what?
Yeah, like I'll give you an example. I would have been 20 or so, and I was doing opposition research at the time in the issues management department in Tim Hudak's cabinet, in Tim Hudak's caucus. And it was summertime, and we were gearing up for an election. And you guys know that when you're in politics, there's a lot of stunts that you do. And the hope of these stunts is that you try to drive media to whatever issue you want to talk about. And one of the stunts that we did was I had to go to the Liberal convention at the time in Richmond Hill. And we had flyers, we had lit that we were handing out that was critiquing Dwight Duncan in some way. And they sent me in to this lion's den. And I had to stand there and start handing this stuff out and, screaming about it. And I think I was just uncomfortable with it at the beginning. But like I said, you're in this environment where they're like, you were actually praised for doing this. And this was your way up in the organization. And there's nothing wrong with it. I just didn't feel like I should have been doing that. And then, another example of that was you were no longer able to see people as people. And when I was in the legislature working, I would see opposition staff not as people, but as the enemy. And I was very young at the time. And I think that was part of it as well. And I just thought that was very unhealthy. Now in a post-politics me, I can see people for people. It doesn't matter, who you worked for or what you did. I don't care. Like you're just a person now. And, I like you, I don't like you. It doesn't really matter, but I see you as a person. And again, part of this was I was young, but you were trained not to think of these people as people. And I was very uncomfortable with that as well.
Yeah. It's one of the really nice things. And I always tried to, when I worked at the legislature, I always tried to keep in mind, I guess, exactly that even the staff like me, but in particular, the opposition caucus members, the NDP members. Yeah. There's always going to be some that you just don't like, just like there are people on our team that that people on the other side don't like. But yeah, you're right. For the most part, the people who work in politics, particularly the politicians, they're good people, right? And most of them, many of them, the person you see in question period that's asking the really hard-hitting questions of your minister or the premier, it's a performance. And as soon as those people walk out, the assembly doors, they are happy to talk to you, and they're the nicest people, even though they're on the other side of politics.
And I just saw people say really mean things to other people for no reason.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, like your point. They're just normal people, and I don't know anything about them. I've never really met these people. I might have met them in passing, and I saw a lot of staffers in particular, and it's because of the environment just be mean to other people for no reason except that they're on the other side of the aisle. And I just don't think that was a very healthy culture. And there would be times when I would do things like that, and I would catch myself doing that. And I'd have to I'd realize that this is a toxic environment for me and not one that I want to be in. And I think to the point of why you guys are doing this whole project, it doesn't have to be that way. That's not how politics has to be. It's just the culture as it is today. And I think it was unhealthy for me, at least.
Brad, you mentioned
picking
something
up on that,
Emile, can I just quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I might forget it. You talked about when you went into the lion's den and you were handing out that those flyers, whatever it was. I think one of the underestimated, or even something that's not talked about at all with political staff in particular, because politicians, they're expected to do this, but doing things like, and it's the most critical thing, but going door knocking and doing, whether or not it was the right good thing to do, doing stunts like that. But political staff need courage to do the work that they do. And a lot of political staff, I would argue, like me, we're not extroverts. So getting the courage, the mental strength to even go and knock on somebody's door, a stranger's door, that can be a tough thing. And I think it's not talked about enough that, door knocking can be both invigorating, but also extremely draining mentally, particularly if you are going in a tough area where that it is not friendly territory, regardless of what party you're with, right?
Totally.
And yeah, that was always something tough for me. So it's an interesting thing for you to bring up.
I hate door knocking, and the phone even more.
Yeah. But the reason why you have to build up courage for some of this stuff is because there is a real risk associated with it. And we can go back to that example I gave of me handing out the flyers. Let me tell you the kind of end result of this, which I think is very bad and should not be encouraged in politics, which is I was giving out these flyers and then people started swarming me. And these liberal staffers, they tried to get me out and they kind of like pulled at me. We got all this on video. That video was uploaded on YouTube, and it was framed by these people, my kind of seniors, as an assault on me. And that person was named in the video. And now that person has this attached to them as being an assaulter associated with their name forever. And there wasn't a lot of thought put into what the consequences of that action are long term. Does this person really deserve that? Absolutely not. They didn't do anything wrong, but they just got caught in the political crossfire. And the courage that these people have to, in many cases, I think door knocking and phone banking is one side of it, but the courage a lot of these staffers have to build up for some of the stuff they're told to do, there are real risks. And, I think you guys in BC, obviously, there's people who've been caught in the crossfire as well there. And it's sad and it's unfortunate. Yeah. And, we've got to figure out how to reduce that risk for people.
And in that situation you just described, Brett, like you were arguably put in real danger, right? Not to laugh, but like looking back, and somebody had, assault, or at least the accusation tied to their name. I'm guessing your team saw it as a win, right? Like this is one of the scenarios that they were hoping would unfold, right?
That's exactly it. The reason why that I was able to move up in politics to not like a particularly senior role, but like a fairly senior role, was that I was willing to do anything. Like that was one of my main selling points as a political staffer, is that I was so loyal and devoted to the cause that if they told me to do something, I would do it unquestionably. So I would put the work in. I would gain the courage to go do whatever I was told to do. And that it was good from a political career standpoint, but it was terrible for me because I ended up regretting, and I still do. I regret a bunch of the things that I did back then. And it's funny because now I run into these people that I had confrontations with. I run into them just organically. We're at events. I see them on the street or whatever. And some of them are just like great people. And they have, they understood that I was young and that I was put into these situations, and they don't hold it against me and they can see beyond it. And I truly do appreciate them. That means a lot to me. Some of them still hate me. And you know what? I actually can't blame them for hating me. Yeah. It was like bad stuff that I was doing back then, and I regret it. But that's the climate that has kind of emerged in modern Canadian politics.
Yeah. So just on that, Brett, you compare politics to, pro sports, right? Or to business, right? Where competition is sort of fundamental to the dynamic, right? Out of two teams, only one can win a game or a match, right? In business, it's maybe a little bit more ambiguous, but there's only so much market share and you're in a race to win it. What is it about politics, do you think, that, and obviously, in sports and business, there are rivalries and occasionally, there's industrial espionage. People do bad stuff, but I think we would agree that in politics, people go a little further, get a little nastier, get a little meaner, a little crueler on sort of an ongoing basis, like not as the exception, but actually as the rule. What do you think it is? Is it the personalities? Is there something special in a terrible way about the dynamic that's set up there? What do you think it is that makes politics different?
Well, I think at the top, there's a culture, and there's a culture that has developed of this is just how politics is done, and I think that's a big problem. Now, the reason why I think politics is particularly bad at this is a couple things. One, it is ideologically driven, and so people truly and deeply hold the values that bring them into politics, and they are so sure that this is the right direction for their city or province or country that they are willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. The second thing is that there's binary outcomes here. You can be a bad professional sports team and the players can still make millions of dollars. In politics, you can't do that. You're either making 50,000 a year in salary in opposition, or you're making 150 a year in government. And so the incentive structure is that you have to be as fierce and competitive as possible and gain whatever edge you can against your opponent.
Well, and Brett, you're also winning or losing.
Yeah, exactly. You're winning or losing. Yeah.
You talk about binary. You talk about government and opposition on the salary side, but you either have the power or you don't.
Exactly. And I think, and this is more philosophical, and I this is like an opinion. It could be entirely off base. But philosophically speaking, I think that there are not enough differences or cleavages in Canadian politics to have some real substantive debate. And so the end result is that you're trying to gain inches on people using external factors. So that would be people's personal lives and people's, all these different things that I don't think should be part of the conversation. You have to kind of lean on more because these are questions of leadership and character rather than of substance and policy. And that I think encourages the sort of behavior that I was mentioning.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dale.
Brett, you worked in the digital side of politics a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things, I don't know if this has been explored elsewhere. I'm sure somebody has looked into it. Is there something to working on in digital in politics where just the nature of that job, where you are constantly, where in particular the comments on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter every day, every minute are in your face? It's literally what you are in charge of doing, not, looking at the comments, but just being on those platforms, and you see what people are saying just because of that. Can we agree that is maybe an unexplored or less talked about part of mental health in politics is the people that are in charge of, pressing send or publish on the ministers, the premiers, social media accounts, and just managing the digital side of things?
Yeah, I think that's true for anybody who is public facing. So, there are some roles in politics that are very behind the scenes. If you're doing organizing, that's actually a good example. If you're doing organizing centrally, then you're dealing with canvas managers at the riding level, and you interact with them and them only. I think it's the same way where whether it's digital or whether you're canvassing or anything that you do that's public facing, it does take a hit on you. If you have a bad day of canvassing and if you're in a bad neighborhood and everyone's telling you to, get off their property, that is tough to take. And I think you're right that we haven't developed a course of action to support people in that process. And so digital, for sure, you're seeing all this negativity online. Look, and there's also instances where you're going to lose the campaign and you just kind of have to ride it out. And that's tough on people because they put so much work into it. They've devoted their lives to this, or their past few years of their lives to something. And you're in this campaign, you're halfway through and you're looking at it and you're saying, the odds are against me now. I'm not going to win. And nobody does anything about it. You just kind of have to keep on going. And that's really, I think, really, really tough on people and not something that's explored enough, especially when you lose your job. People who have worked in government for 4, 5, 6 years, all of a sudden they're done and we just let them go. And I think that's really tough on a lot of folks too.
Yeah, no question. So, I think back to my days in Victoria, working at the legislature there, and, pretty high stress environment, not ideal in a lot of ways. And it's usually no one specific person's fault. It tends to kind of be a function of the system that exists, right? And the people working within that system just kind of adapt their behavior accordingly. But, we'd go out for beers as one would, a group of staffers, and talk about how shitty our jobs were and how exhausted we were and all the rest of it. But there was always this kind of underlying, the end of the sentence is always, but what are you going to do, right? Or, but this is just the way it's going to be, right? Because, and we've talked about this with other guests, like, you can talk all you want about limiting work hours and making sure people get rest and take care of themselves, but the minister still needs his QP briefing, right? The premier still needs that answer on that policy issue. That media request is still sitting there like a ticking time bomb. How do you think you get politics to a place where it's more conducive to mental health without sacrificing sort of the effectiveness and the responsiveness of what those workplaces do? Because you are serving the public ultimately, right?
Yeah, I think it's like any other organization. So I've worked in, and I'll use a better comparison, I think, would be I was at Uber for 3 years. And, when I was at Uber early on, I was probably employee number 2000. It was still fairly early in the company. We were unregulated in a number of different markets, and I was easily working political type hours, if not a bit worse. But, a couple of things made my time at Uber significantly better than my time in politics. And I think the most important thing was the culture. And what I mean by that is that, it was a very welcoming, fun place to be. You were around great people who were very supportive of what you were doing. You felt appreciated for your work. And I think that just lacks in politics. You're dealing with a bunch of people who have never managed anyone before, in most cases, that they've just been thrown into this position of being the chief of staff in a ministry, but they actually have no experience outside of politics. They've only worked in politics. They just happen to be there long enough and be respected well enough within the party that once they take government, they've just been given this chief of staff role, but they don't know how to manage a team. They don't know how to help people develop and make sure everyone's comfortable and that their mental health is good and that they do have a good work-life balance. They just don't have that because they haven't been trained, and there is no training today. I talk to my friends in the legislature here in Toronto, and they tell me that they would love to be a better manager and they try their best to do it, but they just, one, don't have the time, and two, and this is just part of the problem of politics, it's so cyclical and there's so much turnover that it's tough to create that culture. I don't have an answer for you about how to fix it, but I do think that it is just it can be at times a very toxic environment where you're getting yelled at all the time, which should never happen, where you're constantly being criticized, rightly or wrongly, by the public, and there is no support mechanism for you. And again, I don't know how you fix that, and I don't know if there's incentive to fix it, but I think that's, if I was to identify the problems, that would be them.
Yeah. Well, I think it starts at the top, and every guest that I think, Emile, correct me if I'm wrong, I think every guest that we have spoken to has mentioned culture and human resources in politics, regardless of party or province or, state, if we're talking to people in the US or anywhere. And you're right, Brett, the people that, and for good reason, the people that work in politics, particularly younger staff, they are there because of their political support, because of their work that they have done on campaigns or, that they work with political parties. And those people should be there for that reason. It's hard to run to move an agenda forward if you have somebody from the NDP working for the PC party. But I think it starts at the top, and people just need to make the effort to do it. So one of the things that I have been thinking about recently is most human resources directors in legislatures are probably political appointees. What about appointing a deputy director of human resources who is brought in from the public service in, whatever ministry, public service commission, doesn't matter, but somebody who has the experience with actual human resource practices where they can, on a regular basis inform staff about the benefits and the mental health supports and the counseling benefits and everything to do with that. But beyond that, professional development and, seminars or courses or just days where staff can talk to each other and lift each other up. Because that, you're right, that does not happen.
Totally. But I do think, and this is something that I think has to come truly from the top, from the premier or the prime minister, is, and I think we have to be upfront about this. There are some terrible politicians in this country. There are very cruel people that are elected to office that have, because they have been elected to office, that they have they're on this massive ego trip, and they are very mean and unprofessional with staff. And there should be a zero tolerance policy for that. And there should be the opportunity for those staffers to report those people. That should be a public process, that those people who are being unfair and mean to their staff, they must be held accountable for those actions by the public. That is very important. And you hear about it once in a while, because eventually it gets so bad that there is an outpouring of this. But I really do think that is, if you wanted to improve human resources in government, it has to come from the top. And it has to be the prime minister or the premier saying, this is unacceptable. You will not get promoted, or you will not move forward in my administration if you do not treat your staff at the level that we expect you to.
Well, yeah. And, Joe Biden said that, a day or two after he became president, and it was such a quaint idea compared to the way that the Trump administration had dealt with people. And I think, at least I thought this. Biden says that, and I kind of rolled my eyes like, okay, yeah, like we'll see what happens. But then they did actually fire that press secretary and it was, it was a relationship thing with the media, and that was a whole other thing. But I mean, they clearly had a press secretary who was a bit of a dick to people, and that was it for him. So, setting the tone is critical.
And one way to, I think, improve the culture at large is to have a talent pipeline that isn't strictly political people. I think you have to go out there and do some recruiting. You got to find people from other walks of life, obviously, who agree with you and want to advance the agenda. I don't think you should compromise on that, but you have to find people outside of just politics that you can bring in. And I'm not saying that political people shouldn't be promoted or that they shouldn't have these roles. There are some great political staff in this country, but I do think you can avoid this issue, because I think a lot of the times the reason why people aren't held accountable for their actions is because there is concern within the organization that they will not be able to replace that person. And that is a problem. And that's a perverse incentive structure. So if you have a pipeline of talent that you can go out there and recruit and bring into these political roles, but aren't necessarily political, I think you'll have it'll be much easier to hold people accountable.
Yeah. I also, unpopular opinion alert, I think you got to pay people more, right? I don't know what the pay scales are like in Ontario. I certainly know that in Alberta, because we used to look enviously across the Rockies, they're relatively generous, at least compared to what we were making in BC. But to your point, Brett, what I was making when I was at a relatively senior level in a minister's office, I was the most qualified person you could probably attract at that salary, unless you found like somebody with a trust fund who just happens to be exceptionally committed to public service, right? Like, you're not going to hire somebody with 10 more years of experience at that salary. And the pay bands didn't even allow for that, even if you wanted to. So you really limit yourself to that universe of people that, as you say, many of them are fantastic and do a great job. I like to think I did some days more than others, but there's no guarantee of that.
Yeah. That's a great point. You definitely need to pay people more. And just like a lot of things in Canadian politics, there is a orthodoxy that people feel like they must follow, which I do not think is true. And I think this is one of them. I do not think that there would ever be a real complaint or concern by the public about the salaries of staffers. I do not think that
would
will
last
ever
5
come.
minutes, right?
It lasts
like,
5
that
minutes.
sucks. Then they move on.
And it looks bad on everyone if they critique it. And so I don't think that would ever come. And, kudos to, I think, the Ford government. You can see on, it's publicly disclosed what salaries are like. I think they are fairly competitive, but it goes beyond just the pay at that point. And it's then you actually have to go out and get and recruit people to come in. And, a friend of mine, I'll just give him a shout out. My friend, Mark Lawson, who's the chief of staff in finance here, he has done a great job at that. And he's really tried. He's gone out there and he's talked to people and he's used his network and he's tried to bring different folks into government to take these roles. And I think that has been very helpful.
That's great. That's really cool.
I don't think that that's a common thing for the actual staff to go out and do that. At least here in Saskatchewan, that the actual human resources stuff is left up to the people in executive council and the people that are in charge of HR. So yeah, I think you're right. Particularly if you are the one that is wanting to work with the talent, why not just go out and do it and say, and then pass on to, to the human resources people, whatever. I talked to this person. I think I would love to work with them.
And we shouldn't undersell the opportunity. It is a great opportunity for a lot of folks out there. Let's say you're a junior consultant at Deloitte working in public sector consulting. You now get the opportunity to go into government and actually execute on some of the stuff that you've talked to people about before. It is a great opportunity. It can be a lot of fun. You can meet some great people and, get paid, I think, adequately. Not gonna get paid well, but I think you can get paid adequately for doing it. And, we should make that, we should pitch it. It shouldn't just be that to get one of these jobs, you have to do 10 years of door knocking and you have to show your loyalty at all costs. That should not be the case. I think you should, if you believe in the mission of the government, and I think that's contingent on the government to set that vision, if you believe and buy into it, you should be eligible to join it. And I think having divergent opinions is probably a good thing anyways.
Yeah, and I think, as I listen to you talk and think about it some more, I think that bringing more of those types of people into government, at first blush, I thought, well, that's going to suck for the people that did door knock for 10 years, right, and show up for every campaign. But when you think about what that does for a person's network and what it does for their perspective on the world when they're at a relatively early place in their life and stage in their career, had I in my 20s and I was working in the legislature, had the opportunity to work not just with folks that had kind of followed the same trajectory that I did, but also with people from outside of our little orbit that brought different perspectives, different experiences, I probably would have benefited just as much from just being exposed to that greater diversity.
I wouldn't have done as much in politics, to be honest with you. And that's a good thing. I would have, if it was accepted that if you go out and work in business for a bit, you can come back and get a job in politics and do a really good job and get paid well. If I knew that was a pathway for me at the time, I probably would have done that. I wouldn't have spent so much time in politics. And that's not a bad thing. I still would have been involved in politics. I still would have gone to the conventions. I still would have knocked on doors. But then I also would have explored opportunities outside of it, knowing that I can always get back in. And that's my biggest advice to young people who want to get in politics today is I say, don't make politics your first job out of school. Go out there and try to find something else. That political opportunity will always be available for you. And I look in Ontario today, there's so much turnover that, if you are a, smart, ambitious person that has done something outside of politics and you want to get in now, but you've been involved and, you've stayed and you've kind of built your network there, you can always get back in. That opportunity is always there. And in fact, you're likely going to get a more senior role with that outside experience than you would if you had done that 10 years of door knocking. But a lot of people just don't know that at the time because that's not what they're exposed to. The traditional path is to kind of be involved and be as engaged as possible. And eventually you'll win and you'll get that spot. And I just don't think that should be the case. I think it's bad for staffers to think that that's the only route.
Yeah. Brett, you talked a little bit about this. What are the lessons from the private sector that could be transferred into the political world? Because you talked about Uber and your time there. At least, in the last couple of years, it's obviously been better. But Uber for a long while was not known for having a great work culture, and a lot of that had to do with the CEO and the founder, of course. But what are some lessons from there and your time as a startup founder with the Peak?
Uber was the closest thing to politics that you can find in the private sector. It was a mission-driven company that was in constant battles with a number of different constituencies. And so it very much had a political feel to it. And you were fighting political battles, at least where I was on the policy team. So that was a natural fit for me. Even in that environment, though, again, I felt like I did things that I wouldn't have done had I not been in an environment where it was my job to do them. So I think that was bad. Now, what I would say helped a lot is that there is a team of people, at least in the office in Toronto where I was, that was some of the most exceptional, smartest, and thoughtful people I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And everyone became really, really close friends. And that, I think, was an incredible experience that I'm very grateful for. If I was to extrapolate from that one lesson that I think is, and it's funny, I see this a lot now with people who come from politics into the private sector, that there is an aggressiveness that they carry with them. Because in politics, that's the only way to get something done is to be aggressive, to assert yourself. And in the private sector, that has not looked well upon. You have to be collaborative and you have to respect other people's opinions and you have to come to compromise. And I would say if there's one lesson that I learned from, my time at Uber versus my time in politics, but my time, just broadly speaking, in the private sector outside of politics. It's just be nice to people. And this goes back to my point of treat other people like people, not just people on your side, but everyone. Be nice to people. And if you have that as your mission, and if everything that you do, you think about what are the consequences to other people with my actions, I bet you'll be in a much better place, and you won't sacrifice or compromise your values, your personal values, which you hold deeply, as much if you use that as a North Star. And if the culture in politics didn't discourage that, if I had followed my North Star when I was in politics, I would have never been able to grow or develop in politics the way that I did. I would have been discouraged. I would have been kind of sent to the bottom. I wouldn't have been loyal enough. I wouldn't have been devoted enough to the cause. And I wouldn't have been promoted at the speed or the rate I was, because I kept saying no. But I knew I should have said no. And I regret not saying no now. And if I had just used this core principle of just be nice to people and do things that you're comfortable with, that would have been, I think, really helpful for me. And if we had a culture of that, that would be helpful for everyone.
What did you say no to? Just to go back to that, what were you saying no to taking new jobs and the like next job up in politics?
Sorry, I didn't say no to anything. And that was the problem. I would say yes to whatever. I would say yes to whatever they gave me, no matter how crazy it was, or no matter how uncomfortable I was doing it. And the reason, and because I said yes to everything, that's why I was promoted so quickly. I think that's a bad culture. You should have room for people to say no to things and still be respected for what they bring to the organization, and still have a path for promotion. And you should not quickly be written off as not loyal enough or devoted to the cause.
Yeah,
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah,
because the advice that young staffers still get is say yes to everything. In fact, I've given that advice to people, right? When I've been on panels or kind of helping mentor people, is that mentality of just show up and work harder than everybody else. Because a lot of people working in politics now, or who have become senior in politics, they got there doing that, right? So it's almost like the law firm analogy, right? Where the associates get treated like shit and the partners are fine with it, because that's the way it's always been, and they had to go through it too.
Well, working hard and saying yes to everything are two different things. I think you can work exceptionally hard in politics and still be comfortable with what you're doing and proud of your work. And, this is something that I think a lot of people in investing talk about, but they say, I don't want to be involved in a project that I can't tell my kids about. And that is a good way to look at it. And so, there's lots of businesses that come a lot of people's way, and they evaluate those businesses about whether they should invest in them or not. And if they look at that business and they say, wow, this could be a great business, or it makes a lot of money, it might be an excellent asset, but I can't tell my kids about it, I'm not going to do that, because they're not prepared to sacrifice their values. And I think that's the same thing that we should have for political staffers, which is you should only do things that you're totally comfortable with. And you should really think through, if you're uncomfortable with it, or you have the inclination to be uncomfortable with it, you should have the opportunity to think through that and make an informed decision.
The loyalty piece, Brett, that you mentioned is so important, and we can move on after I say this. But I'm just thinking about the times, and particularly with the stuff outside the political buildings, like outside the legislature, like door knocking in particular. It's come up lots in this conversation, but like I can think of days where I felt like I didn't have the mental stability or the strength to go door knocking for 3-4 hours after I'd just been working all day. But I felt I had to go because the deputy chief of staff to the premier was coming around to each office and making sure that everybody was going door knocking that night. And you feel like you can't say no, even though you know that you will be just like, the experience will not be good. You will not be presenting well to the people you're talking to on their doorsteps. But I think that's a common thing, and I'm so glad you said there's a difference between working hard and saying yes to everything.
The other thing I'll say,
you can skip one door knocking session.
The other thing I'll say about the loyalty piece, and this is again why I encourage people to not have politics as their first job and to come back to it when they're ready and want to, is because it's okay for your opinions to change. And, I kind of went through that process myself, and it was very interesting where, I had grown up as a conservative, literally grown up as a conservative. I was extremely active in the party, very loyal. I did lots of things for them, many things I was uncomfortable with, as I've mentioned. And, about in 2016, I kind of changed entirely. I did a full 180. And so I would say now, if I was to describe myself, I would say I'm a democratic socialist. And that process now of discovering myself and truly feeling comfortable in my politics and what I believe, that now, if I was to go back into politics, I would be 10x a better staffer and a better addition to the team than I was before, because I've now had perspective and I have been able to live a life where I am comfortable with exactly what I believe and I am fully bought into that vision. And so I'm not loyal for the sake of my profession. I'm not loyal because I feel obliged to, because like you said, the deputy chief of staff is there and you got to do it. I'm not loyal because I believe in it. And I think far too often there's a lot of people in government who just don't believe in what they're advocating for.
Brett, how many staff do you, or how many people do you have working on the peak?
There's 3 of us and we're just about to hire someone.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how far into the culture side of things you guys are, but do you want to just talk a little bit about what the culture and what the mental health with your company these days looks like? I mean, you guys are, I'm assuming, well, no, I guess you said that you're inside of it. You want to keep growing more and more, and the pace is probably slower than we would want. But can you just talk a bit about the work that you guys are doing in terms of culture and mental health?
Yeah, it's something I'm thinking a lot about right now, especially as we look to bring someone on. What I will say is, among me and my 2 co-founders, we're very fortunate in that we've known each other for a really long time and we're very close friends. And so the relationships that we have extend into business. And so we're very comfortable with each other. We can disagree and be okay with it. With the decision that we make, we have, processes in place where we can discuss things. And I think that's really good and really healthy. And I'm very happy with that. Can it be better? Probably, but I think it's good. And I feel great about that. Now, the challenge I have right now is we're going to bring someone into that dynamic where, you've got 3 of us who are, very close and all think on the same wavelength. And this person that we bring in likely will not. And so for me, it's how do I bring that person in, make them feel comfortable, valued, make sure they have a fulfilling career, or make sure they feel like they have a fulfilling career ahead of them. And that's really tough to do. And it's my first time doing it, to be honest with you. And so, some things I'm already thinking about just based on conversations I've had with other people about the best way to do this is, for the first few months, I'm going to talk to this person every morning and every evening. So start of the day, end of the day. And those conversations are going to be just getting to know them personally. The work is one thing, and that's important for sure, but just getting to know them personally and making them feel comfortable to open up to me about what's going on with their mental health. Are they feeling stretched? Do they want, do they need their workload reduced? Do they want to feel more part of the team? Are they uncomfortable with something we're doing? All of that I think is so important. And, I think this is what's great about the work you're doing is it's so important for people to open up. And again, connecting this back to political culture, it is strongly discouraged to open up. Once again, it's always a question of loyalty. And if you open up and you say something that's not in line, your loyalty is questioned. So, I think that's probably the number one thing that I'm focusing on when we bring this person in, is having someone who feels comfortable to share whatever they're thinking or whatever they want to share, obviously, but whatever they want to share with myself and our team, and that we are open and receptive to that and we act on it.
What's the past year been like with your co-founders working on the peak? Has the pandemic changed work operations in terms of, did you guys used to work together in at a co-work space or an office, and now you're each at your own homes, or how's that been going?
Well, Dale, like most people my age in Toronto, we all live within a 5 to 10 block radius from each other. So that really helps. And so we can see each other a lot, which is great. Yeah, I'll tell you this is that, prior to the peak, we had this thing called Leap Forward. It was an accelerator and venture fund, and we were investing in early stage cannabis companies. And, we will get everyone's money back, and there will be probably a slight return for our investors. But I think it wasn't as successful as we thought it was going to be. And when you enter into a venture like that, it's really tough. There are some really tough times because it's peaks and valleys, but the valley, they call it the trough of sorrow, can last a really long time. And going through that experience with 2 people really tells you a lot about how compatible you are with them from both a personal and a work relationship. And so what I'm very fortunate for is that I have had both, good days and really bad days with these 2 other co-founders of mine. And because we've been able to get through those bad days, I have a high confidence that we'll be able to drive this business forward, because the peak, and this is like to the start of this whole conversation, it's got good days and bad days. Some days I feel great. Sometimes we close a big sale. Sometimes we get a new 1,000 subscribers and I feel great about it. And I think we're going in the right direction. Other days I go, growth feels like it's plateauing, or I haven't gotten a sale in a while. Like, can we grow this thing? Can we make it a sustainable business? I get a no from an investor, or somebody criticizes me on something. I make a mistake in the email and I get 10 emails about it. There's a bunch of factors that can make a bad day bad. And when that happens, I'm just lucky that I know that I have a team of people around me that I can lean on, that when those days are bad, and that we can get through them.
I think the term trough of sorrow might become the title of my memoir on my time in politics.
Yeah, I never heard that.
That's very helpful.
Like it.
It's a startup term. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, trough of sorrow. Okay. Emile, I look forward to reading that book when you write it, by the way.
It's not going to be a fun read, but it'll be interesting. I'll write it when I'm retired.
What's the one big final kind of to close things off here? What's the one big piece of advice? Is it for staff in particular? Is it to go and work outside of politics, or work somewhere in the private sector before going working there? What do you think?
Yeah, my career advice would be to definitely go and do things outside of politics, and never make politics your life. Make it a part of your life and an interest and something you're passionate about, but do not make it your life. Always make sure that you have things outside of it, whether you're a staff or whether you want to become a staff and you want to go out and do something else. I would always recommend to have other things. And I think this is what's tough about being in Ottawa, is that it's very easy for politics to become all encompassing in your life, where you are only hanging out with other staffers, you're only going to parties with other staffers, and you're only talking about politics. That's one thing that was really great about working at Queen's Park, is that, there's you're in Toronto, there's lots of other stuff to do and see, and lots of other people to meet. And so that's, I think, very healthy. So yeah, I think, one, have something outside of your life if you're in politics. Two, do other things outside of politics. These political opportunities will always be available to you. And in fact, you'll likely be able to advance your career faster in politics if you do things outside of it. And three, I think the most important piece of advice for anyone who is in politics, and what I would, if I was to do it all over again, the one thing I would do is I would really evaluate whether I was comfortable with something or not. And I would say no to anything that I was uncomfortable with, based on my core values of how people should be treated and what we should be doing. And I wouldn't have shied away from that. And I understand that if you're young and you're in politics, it can be terrifying to do that, because you will in this current environment, you likely will get shunned for it. But you should know that those values are the most important thing that you have, and that it's very important to stay true to them. And that there are many other, you got into politics because you're smart enough to get into politics, because you work hard, and there will always be other opportunities for you outside of politics, and that those values you should never, ever compromise on.
A lot of those things that you just said, I could have benefited from, particularly in the last few years since I've gotten kind of out of official politics. Because when I worked at the legislative building, that was really all that I did in many ways. I always wanted to take a sign language class, just like level 1 sign language. It was something that I was interested in, but I always told myself, at least, that no, I can't do that, because it's something that you do in the night, in the evenings, and I probably will have to go door knocking.
Yeah.
And I think I missed out on that, and I still want to do it. And, even something like reffing basketball. I used to do that when I was younger, and it's hard to do that because, for whatever reasons, I told myself about the work that I was doing. But yeah, no, it's very important advice, Brett. And so thanks for sharing your story with us. It was good to meet you.
Yeah, nice meeting you too. Thanks for having me on. And great work, guys. I think it's so important what you're doing. And like I said, I'm a strong believer that just because things have been done a certain way in the past doesn't mean that's the best way to do them. And we can change things, obviously, and politics is no exception to that. And I think that the work you're doing is hopefully moving the needle and improving the conditions for the environment for political staffers in this country. So very important.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Brett. And we couldn't do it without folks like you that are willing to really courageously share their stories and open up about their experiences and spread the word. So thanks for being awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, Brett. Good chatting to you.
Okay.
Yeah, good to see you, Brett.
Yeah, good seeing you too, Emile.
We'll be in touch.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
See you, man.
Cheers.
Bye.